Alright guys, welcome to another video. So in this one we're going to be talking about routers, kind of everything you want to know about routers and some important features to look for when you're buying a router. So right off the top, I'm going to start by saying this video is not sponsored. You can see I've got mostly Bosch equipment here. I really like Bosch routers and their surrounding accessories, but this is not sponsored by Bosch, nor will it probably ever be. And so these are just the ones I have because I like them. Most of the stuff we're going to be talking about in this video is going to be applicable to most brands on the market. So to start us off, let's talk about the types of routers. So the first type of router is the one I have that would include both of these, would be kind of your standard routers. Now your standard routers are most useful for, well, they're kind of your most useful router. They're used in the most general cases for doing everything from edge profiles. They can do a little bit of slab flattening. They're great. They're generally great to have in a router table for a beginning woodworker. And they can kind of fit the most variation of bits and are the best balance between power and mobility. And so as you can see, both of these being that standard router, they're both, these Bosch routers are about 2.25 horsepower. Now that's pretty typical. Most standard size routers are anywhere from 2 to 2.5 horsepower. And they usually have a pretty good base with good handles. As you can see, both of these have fairly good handles for manhandling and maneuvering the routers around. The next class of routers is compact routers. Now, I don't currently own a compact router just because I can't afford one at this point in time, but I'm looking at getting the Bosch Colt, which I'll pop a picture up on the screen here, which is a small compact router. And so the main uses for a compact router are adding small edge profiles or flush trimming panels to length and all that kind of stuff. You're generally not going to be using a compact router on a router table just because they are so small they don't fit into most router tables. And so compact routers, again, are extremely useful tools for doing small work and a little bit more detailed work, but they do have their limitations. Generally, they are 1 to 1.5 horsepower, but again, you're trading off the power and horsepower and bits that you can use for that small compact size. On the flip side, you've got heavy-duty routers. Now, there's kind of two subcategories of heavy-duty routers. The first is your kind of handheld heavy-duty routers. Now, these are generally right around the 3 horsepower, 3 to 3.25 horsepower. Most common one you've probably seen is the Triton 3.25 horsepower. This is a behemoth-looking handheld router, and mainly these are used for slab flattening or really big edge profiles. So if you want to do like a 3/4 inch roundover, you're going to be using a pretty big, hefty router. That's just because you need a lot of extra horsepower to push those bigger bits around. You can also use those heavy-duty routers for doing small tasks. Like theoretically, you could put a 1/4 inch bit inside of a 3 horsepower router. It's just a little bit overkill, and generally the trade-off with the handheld heavy-duty routers is that they are just large and bulky, and they've got a lot of power to drive the bits, so they're a little bit more, so they're not as well suited to doing stuff where you want a little bit more ability. So again, on that side, you're trading mobility for power. The next subcategory of heavy-duty routers is the ones that are generally not handheld. These are usually over 3.5 horsepower. Then they're mounted into most router tables. Now, I don't know many brands that make these, but I know Porter Cable makes one, and I believe it's a 4 horsepower, just a motor that they sell that is designed to be mounted into a router table, CNC, that kind of thing. And again, the reason you're not handheld holding that is because 4 horsepower is quite a bit of power to try and control with your hands, so it is meant to be put into a router table. So those are your 3 main types of routers. You got your compact, standard, and heavy duty. Now within those 3 types of routers, you've generally got 2 different bases that you'll see on most of them. Well, there really is only 2 bases. You'll get fixed base like the one on my right here, and you've got plunge base like the one on my left. Now, some brands do give you the ability to switch out the router base. For example, on this one, you can see I've got the plunge base installed, and I get to have a fixed base that I can move the motor over to. And that's a great feature. Some brands allow you to do that, some don't. Again, it all depends on whatever brand you're looking at, but that's one of the main reasons I do like Bosch, is because you can take the same motor and put it into multiple different bases. So to start us off, let's talk about plunge bases. So the plunge base is the one I've got right here. Now, what the plunge base is meant for is anytime you want to be able to start the bit outside of the board, outside of the material, and generally you're going to be working from the inside of the material out, or you just don't want to cut through an edge. Say a good example of this is when you're cutting a dado. You might not want to put the dado all the way through to the outer edge so that you can have kind of a half-blind dado situation. Now, what's really good about this is because you can drop the bit down into the material by pulling the little lever on the back here and push it through, and then you can stop moving the router, pull the little lever, and the bit retracts out of the material. Now again, this is great for doing everything from dados to cutting mortises, well, pretty much any time you want the bit to start outside of the material. And generally, accuracy is important, but not the main concern. This is also a much safer way to do this. You can technically get a bit in and out of material with a fixed base, but then you have to pick up the router with the spinning blade, which is just not a great situation in general. So plunge bases are great for handheld work in general, but that's where they're meant for. On the flip side, fixed bases are great for accuracy. You can set a very precise bit depth, and generally they'll have some way to adjust it in a very accurate fashion. So some good examples of where you want to use a fixed base router is with edge profiles. Generally, when you're setting up say a chamfer to put around the edge of a case, you're going to want that chamfer to be the exact same around the whole perimeter of the case. So the benefit of the fixed base router is that when you set that bit depth and you lock it in, it is going to stay at that depth no matter what happens. The router is always going to be at that bit depth. Whereas on a plunge-based router, it can be a little bit more complicated because you are manually changing the depth of the bit multiple times possibly. You can inadvertently change the depth while you're going around the outside of the case. It's all very theoretical, but that's one of the main benefits of a fixed base. So one of the biggest benefits of a fixed base router is that generally the collet can extend past the baseline of the router. So what all that means is that the actual head of the motor, where the bit would attach to, on a fixed base router, this little threaded area here you can see can go past the baseline, which gives you a little bit extra bit depth. This is great for things like slab flattening, where generally your bits are very short. I actually have a slab flattening bit here. You can see how short the actual bit is, and so you want to be able to get your motor as close to the material so you get the best transfer of energy to the actual cutting edge. And so that's where having a fixed base router that can push that can bring the motor much lower is beneficial over a plunge router, which generally the collet can't extend past the baseline of the router. And so the last benefit of a fixed base router is that it can be mounted into router tables. Now again, if you've got a high-end router table that has its own mount and all that, and you're just attaching a motor, that's completely separate. But if you're a beginning woodworker and you just kind of want to get a router table, or you're looking at getting a entry-level router table or building your own, most of these router tables will have a little plate with some screw holes, and you can only use fixed base routers in those router tables. The reason you can't use a plunge base is because you don't want to have to reach under the table every single time and kind of plunge the router upwards. It's not super safe and it's not super accurate, so you're going to want to go for a fixed base if you're planning to use it in an entry-level router table. So that's the main difference between those two bases. My suggestion would be, if you're just starting out, start with a fixed base router. It's a little bit easier to learn on. And then if your main goal is to cut things like mortises, then you may want to start with a plunge base. Again, it all comes down to what you're planning to do with the router. But again, my suggestion would be to start with a fixed base, and when you realize you need a plunge router, either buy the additional base for it or buy a specific plunge router. So the last thing we're going to talk about is router features and accessories. Now, to start us off, the very first most important feature that every router you buy should have is a variable speed setting. So both of these routers are variable speed, and so I believe all the routers in Bosch's selection are variable speed. And so the reason this is important is because speed determines how well your bits function and how long they last. If you're trying to spin something like a slab flattening bit at the top speed of most routers, which is generally around 24,000 RPM, not only is that dangerous because you can cause bit failure because they're not meant to be spun that fast, but it'll also dull the bit and wear down your motor a lot faster. So if you're spinning something like a slab flattening bit, you're generally going to want to go around 2,000 to 3,000 RPM. And so on the flip side, if you're trying to do something like a half-inch upcut spiral bit, trying to go at 2,000 to 3,000 RPM is going to be far too slow. It's not going to cut efficiently or nicely. You're going to want to be up at that 24,000 RPM. So the variable speed is not only great for just functionality, but it also adds a lot of confidence. I know personally the first two routers I owned, which was a cheap little Ryobi one and the Porter cable, I don't remember the model number, but it's kind of a common Porter cable router. They weren't variable speed, and they were both well over 24,000 RPM. So when I started trying to do bits besides just a straight upcut bit, they were just way too fast and were quite dangerous to work with. And so going to a variable speed, I was able to slow it down, and I became much more confident in using the router, and it, well, honestly became much more enjoyable. So I would highly suggest to anyone looking at routers, never buy a router that's not variable speed, because it's just going to be a waste of money in the long run. So the next important feature is adjustable collet size. Now the collet is what actually holds your bit into the router motor. It's just a little piece of metal that as you thread it in and tighten it, it grips around the router bit and holds it in. So most standard and heavy duty routers will come with both a 1/4 inch and a 1/2 inch collet. Some heavy duty routers will come with a 3/4 inch collet, but you're talking like big scary bits at that point, and that's a whole separate video. Most compact routers will only come with a 1/4 inch collet, because you're limited to those smaller bits that would fit inside of a 1/4 inch collet. So having both of those options available to you is good. Again, most brands will include, for a standard router, will include both a 1/4 inch and a 1/2 inch collet, but it's just a good thing to make sure of. Next up in the features list is one of my favorite features, and kind of the reason that I own two separate routers, is a trigger switch. So this is very common in high-end routers. For example, the Festool ones, I believe, all have this feature, but it's very uncommon in kind of your big box store routers. So that's one of the things I really like about Bosch, is they managed to get this technology into a router that they can sell in the big box store that is under $500. So what I mean by a trigger switch is on the handle here, where you're actually handling the router from, there's a power switch. So what this is great for is anytime I'm handling the router by hand, obviously that's where I would use this. And so the only time the bit is running is when I'm pulling that switch. So the reason I like this feature over the standard style, which is just a switch on the top of the router motor, is because when you're handling this style of router, you have to take your hand off the handles, off the controls of the router to turn your switch off. Now, again, it's not unsafe, but it's just a little bit better to be able to turn the router off from a nice, safe, and secure position. So it's all about personal preference. I find this much more comfortable, much more enjoyable to use. And so mainly for handheld routing, I use this router with either the fixed base or the plunge base installed. And just because I find it a little bit more enjoyable to use and a little bit safer and nicer. And so another feature is the ability to mount on guide bars or rails or anything like that. So again, Bosch has a nice feature where you can buy their specific branded guide bar, which mounts into 2 holes in the base, and the guide bar just slides in and lets you reference off an edge of a workpiece. Now again, this has pretty obvious benefits because you can reference off the edge of a workpiece if you're cutting a groove or rabbet or dado down the edge of a workpiece. But you don't need to focus on brands that only offer that option. You can also make your own. For example, I have this router base that I made out of a 3/4 inch piece of acrylic and a couple chunks of white oak and some T-screws and handles. Now, all this does is, I just screw this into the bottom of the router base. So you can see on the router base that there are some holes on the bottom. And so Bosch is really good, and they include some extra long screws that will fit through 3/4 inch acrylic because it's meant for doing stuff like this. So this base can do the exact same thing as this guide bar if I take off one of the white oak pieces. But what I mainly use this base for is cutting mortise and tenon. So I'll screw it onto the bottom of my plunge base router here, and it just lets me clamp onto a piece of material and get the exact same width and size mortises every single time. So that's one benefit. And most routers will let you change out the base so that you can add in a homemade base like that. It's usually not a feature that's special to one brand or another. It's just kind of a common thing. So if you don't want to go out and spend the, I think $70 on the Bosch guide bar, you can always make your own for, I think that one cost me $30 or $40 off Amazon. So again, it's a nice feature to have, the ability to put in those rods and give you a good accurate guide bar, but you can also make your own fairly easily. Next up, a feature that I don't really care about, but is something some people like to consider, is chip collection. Now, the Bosch routers don't have they don't have any chip collection. You can buy a little accessory piece, but the reviews on it are absolute trash, and so I have never considered buying it. And the reason for that is I don't really care that much about chip collection. One of the biggest things to know about routers is that they are just an absolute messy disaster. There's nothing you can really do to make a router much cleaner unless you try to get up into the high-end routers that do specialize in dust collection. For example, I know Festool routers do have fairly good dust collection, but again, they still make a pretty good mess from what I've seen. So dust collection is one of those things where it's some routers that have it, some brands offer better options, but it's something that I personally don't care about, but if you do, make sure you research it. And so the last thing we'll talk about for features and accessories and that is just general accessories available to your router brand. So again, if this is something that matters to you, having a more adaptable router, make sure you do your research. Again, this is where I really like Bosch because every router they have has really good versatility to it. So just in a second here, I'll show you guys my Bosch router table, which is an accessory that Bosch provides. Well, gives you the option to buy because they're not cheap, but they give you the option to be able to get a cheaper router table than what you can typically buy, which is really nice if you're just getting started, like I was when I bought it, and it gives you the ability to have a router table without spending tons of money. And just generally, Bosch has a lot of really good accessories. So some of the accessories that I've got here are wrenches specifically designed to work with the router table. Really nice. Well, we've got the guide bar, we've got different bases. I believe from Bosch you can also buy this little key, which when your router is when your fixed base router, I believe either one of these. Yeah, so either one of your fixed bases is mounted into a router table. You can use this little key to adjust it from the top side, which is just, again, a nice feature to have. They've got a whole ton of other accessories and stuff, but these are kind of the stuff that I've been able to buy because they're stuff that I've needed at the time. So let's jump over to the router table and I'll give you a quick showdown on what I've got set up there, and then we'll come back here. So this is my router table. Basically, it's just a little cabinet and with the steel plate on top that you mount the router into. It's kind of useful. It also has a fence that gets mounted on top. Now what I really like about this router table is it's a super cheap and simple option. Now you can build your own little router table. I think you can buy these like top plates off of Amazon for I would say under 40 bucks, which is a good option. Or you can buy this, I think this on Amazon is about $200, and it just gives you a good surface with a good guide bar and all that pre-installed. It's just kind of generally a half decent option. All right, and so that's basically everything you need to know about routers, what you need, what you're looking for when you're buying them, and kind of just all the generally important information to understand about routers. So if you have any questions or concerns about routers, you want to know more about these Bosch routers that I have or other brand suggestions, feel free to leave a comment or send me a message. I'm always happy to help. And yeah, so I do hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one.